But I really don't have any regrets. I really don't. I've lived exactly how I've wanted to. I've tried my hardest every single time. I didn't win the matches that maybe I should have always won, but I really gave it my all. So that for me is enough.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the Body Serve podcast. I'm James.
I'm Jonathan.
We are reporting this week at the Western and Southern Open in Cincinnati, Ohio. We are currently experiencing the first major rain delay, so we're taking advantage of that time to record a spot.
We're happy to bring you this episode on the back of our Pride special a couple months ago, where we gave you a partial history of LGBT folks in tennis. This episode we're going to talk about a tweet that you may have seen on our Body Serve account the last couple days, where we got the chance to ask Roger Federer why he thought there haven't been any openly gay tennis players on the ATP. The reason this all came about and why we wanted to pursue this at this tournament, a couple weeks ago, Nick McCarvel tweeted about an upcoming event in New York City called Open Playbook, Being Queer and Out in Pro Tennis. And it's going to feature Brian Vahaly, who is now openly gay. He was a former pro tennis player, top 70. And it's about starting the dialogue about being out and proud in tennis, right? It's something that hasn't happened on the ATP Tour yet. We've had lots of out lesbians on the WTA Tour. In fact, the tour itself was founded by some of the most prominent lesbian athletes in all of sport history.
In the 1970s, we even had an out trans woman play at the US Open, as you know, Renee Richards. This has been lacking on the ATP side, and it's something that the organizers of this event, Nick, No Challenges Remaining, they want to talk about and bring out into the Open, start the conversation. And Kevin Anderson was very helpful in pushing that conversation into the mainstream in the tennis world. Not
even just pushing the conversation, but getting it started. Because that's something that we've come to realize, that as much as we may think some of the discussion that's happening right now is elementary, it's needed because we're coming from ground zero. There's nothing that's been going on. So Kevin Anderson quote tweeted Nick McCarvel, and what did he say?
He said, "Words that come to mind when I think about people who are out. Courageous, strong, progressive, fearless, and leaders. Very proud of my friend Nick for embodying these attributes, and I hope you will support his cause if you are in New York on August 23rd, followed by a rainbow and a pound emoji. So this is a very, very clear, cannot be misinterpreted statement in support of LGBT athletes, fans, the community in general, which is not exactly common to hear among ATP players.
I think a lot of folks, when they saw that tweet, they were taken aback because we absolutely never hear these kinds of words from male tennis players. Like if somebody's asked about it, perhaps, but this was voluntary, right? Kevin Anderson did not have to do this. He's a two-time slam finalist, top 10 player. He's at the apex of his career right now. This is his highest profile he's ever had. And he's using his platform for good to uplift LGBT folks from his ATP platform in ways it's never been done before.
Right, because I don't think that any player, Kevin included, stands to gain much, especially not financially, by making statements like this. This is kind of in keeping with his just very nice guy persona.
So when we got to Cincinnati, we were discussing what are some of the things that we want to do while we're here. And after having done the Pride special, that partial history of LGBT folks in tennis, we understood that there was a huge vacuum and a discrepancy between the WTA and ATP in terms of its queering histories. And so we talked about Bill Tilden, but he was not out at the time. If he was, it was a glass closet, but it was also a totally different time. The sport wasn't professional back then in the way it is now. The ATP wasn't around back then. And while we documented the host of WTA players who've since been out and active on the WTA Tour and who we know about post-retirement or whatever, we haven't even had ATP players who've come out after retirement until really Brian Vahaly, which is, it's shocking in this day and age, truly, with so many other sports, so many other team sports that are thought to be more dominated by toxic masculinity, that would be less of a safe environment for an openly gay player. They've dealt with this. We've seen examples of how this has happened in other male sports. Right? But tennis, in spite of having a large gay following, having a large gay history, an expansive gay history, the ATP is, for whatever reason, a sporting organization and a tour where this has not happened. And so this is something that we wanted to explore a little bit and find out why.
So on this episode, we are going to bring you that audio from both Roger Federer and Kevin Anderson fielding these questions in press this week at Cincinnati. We will also be featuring our interview with Nick McCarvel. He gives a lot of great information about this event, but we also just kind of have a discussion about where we're at in tennis as far as openness about LGBT players, whether the sport is welcoming, what are the barriers for players to come out. And I think it was just a great discussion, and we appreciate having Nick on the show.
So here's the audio of me asking Roger Federer why there haven't been any openly gay players on the ATP Tour, and if the ATP is a receptive and safe space, should one choose to do so. Roger, there's an event coming up in New York City featuring Brian Vahaly, who is a now out gay former pro ATP player. And Kevin Anderson tweeted in support of it, also had some very kind words to say for some of the gay people that he knows in his life. I'm wondering if you have a sense of why we haven't had an openly gay tennis player on the ATP Tour, and if there's anything you can say as to whether the ATP would be a safe and receptive place for a player to come out.
Yeah, I think no problem at all. It is true. Yeah, we have not had it. Don't know why, if we haven't had any, or some players just chose not to do it, I think it'd be totally accepted, no problem, And I don't know, what tournament are they?
It's just an event celebrating culture and tennis and
diversity. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, no, I'm all for it. It's a good thing, I'm all for it, that everybody, doesn't matter where you come from, who you are. I'm all for it, that you're open about it. That I think you'll feel better in the process, to be honest. And everybody should support one another on this planet. It's all good.
Now we've got a lot of response on Twitter from this tweet.
We posted the text of the question and answer on Twitter, and as you said, it kicked off a lot of response, a lot of discussion. I would say the majority of it was very positive, in praise of Roger for really even being willing to answer the question thoughtfully, because it's uncommon, especially among the top tiers of men's tennis.
And then there's some who say that it wasn't thoughtful at all, that it was very generic, that it was too politically correct, that he didn't even use the word gay in his response. There was a lot of it. And so we have two opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of the intense praise for him, and then folks who are very disappointed.
And I think there was a lot in the middle, acknowledging his willingness to engage, but also asking, could he have made a stronger statement? There are considerations about why players don't come out that maybe Roger is just not currently engaging with, because it's not something that he has to. Mm-hmm. So I think there was a lot of germane discussion going on around this tweet, which we appreciate. But I think maybe we should set the scene a little bit, just to provide some context to how the question was asked and in what situation.
One of the critiques of Roger's response was that he sounded uncomfortable. That response was coming from just reading the text. So I hope that, having listened to the audio, you're able to make a more fully formed opinion if you were so inclined to think that. What I will say, and I absolutely want to defend Roger here, is that this question came totally out of the blue. And this was my first Roger Federer All Access Hour. In case you're not familiar, the tours at these big events, they provide access to the top seeds on both tours. In this case, it's a joint event, so we get both the top 8 seeds of the men and the women. They come in, they sit at a round table, and then you fire away questions at them for around 10 to 15 minutes, and then another player comes in, right? And so for a lot of folks, they don't often get a chance to ask Roger Federer a question. For a lot of folks, it's about finding out where he is health-wise. He didn't play in Toronto. They want to know what's the state of his game now, what are his plans going forward, stuff that's very much X's and O's tennis related. And then on top of that, there's no real format in terms of who is being called upon. Mm-hmm. And so what you have is Roger sitting there and then people shouting questions, and then one eventually gets through. Somebody eventually breaks through that initial scrum to be able to ask Roger the question. And I had failed 3 or 4 times before I finally, you heard at the start of that question that there were a lot of people trying to ask a question, a lot of people saying Roger, and then eventually I guess I was loud enough to be able to get it there. And so after being asked just before about Mirka, having to talk about Mirka and stuff to do with his family life, here I am asking him this question that he's probably never been asked before, that he wasn't expecting, that he likely has not given much thought, because a lot of times these press conferences and these all accessors aren't political. A lot of folks make it a cause to keep sports separate from politics, or vice versa. And one of the main tenets of this podcast is that we believe that they cannot be separated.
And that we live in the same world that these athletes live in, and we all face struggle. And sport to me is just not interesting without all of the extra context floating around it, mm-hmm. right?
So this critique of Rogers having been uncomfortable, I rebuke it to an extent, because he absolutely was caught off guard, and I think he pivoted well. What do you make of the critique that he was way too generic and too politically mm-hmm. correct?
If you know Roger Federer, this is not surprising. His personality is very measured. He rarely takes stands that are going to really ruffle a lot of feathers. He's not a mean-spirited guy, but Roger is Roger. He's a brand. He's important to a lot of people. He is like the supreme, to some people, god of the sport. He's going to keep being Roger. I wasn't expecting anything revolutionary, but I was pleasantly surprised at how he responded, how he took a beat, and really genuinely tried to answer the question well. Mm-hmm. Even though, to be fair, he was completely caught off guard.
Yeah, and without the language, or a grasp of the language that we would want to hear.
Right. And we have said this many, many times, that, Roger Federer is a master of several languages, mm-hmm. but in our own native language, we struggle sometimes for the right words to talk about these issues.
And also in this culture, the way it's talked about might be totally different from another.
Right. I hear the responses. I was happy to see them, but I think all things considered, he handled it quite well.
Yeah, and the main goal here was, having had this not really talked about by top players before, the goal here was to get him on record. And I expected him to answer it well. And I think he answered it well and positively. And the net effect of having Roger Federer, the player that most folks consider the greatest of all time, who is still active, still at the top of the game, who is the elder statesman of men's tennis, to offer words of support and encouragement for gay people, not just gay tennis players, but gay people in general. That's something that's now part of the record. That if somebody were to come and say, well, I think that's terrible and we're not having that. Well, Roger Federer said this, and that's important, mm-hmm. And so I don't think it's utile for us to parse his words to the extent where we're like, well, we wanted it perfect, we wanted it this way, we wanted him to paint it every color of the rainbow to our liking. There's still a lot of good that can come from this.
Now, Kevin Anderson, on the other hand, was a little bit more ready for the question, because he, as we said, has opened up the conversation on his own.
Here's Kevin's audio.
A few weeks ago, you tweeted something in support of LGBT athletes with relation to that event with Brian Vahaly, hosted by Nick McCarvel. Yep. It's not altogether common to hear ATP players say things about that. What kind of compelled you to speak up?
Yeah, it's it's actually that's really close to me. I'm, as I've said, I'm a huge supporter of that. My cousin actually just got married, to his partner just last year, so it's touches very close to home, for me. yeah, just, the way I view it is just, just from a human rights standpoint, I feel, very strongly on that front. So, seeing that event, I mean, I thought it was, fantastic. I mean, just speaking to some, people, as my cousin, I understand the challenges, in today's world, especially in sports as well. You've seen, more people, feeling comfortable with it over the last few years, but, that you still know, just given the stats that people run and how many athletes there are, there's still, a lot who don't feel comfortable. So I think that's, they shouldn't, would like to create an atmosphere where people don't feel that way. So that's why, I thought it was such a great, event to be part of.
Do you get a sense that the ATP as it is now, maybe from talking to other players or just from observing, that it's a place that's a safe space for an athlete should they choose to come out?
To be honest, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's not something that's been spoken about too much, to be honest with you, because there's not been, many examples of it. I think, if I do think back in my own mind, the sort of conversations just in the locker room and stuff, it's not really something that's come up to be honest with you. I mean, I would really hope so. I mean, and speaking to guys, I mean, especially today, I think, at least a lot of the players that, I'm chatting to more often, obviously you can't spend a lot of time with everybody. I mean, but the people who I do, I think would all be very, supportive of, of that. So, I'd certainly like to think so. And if I can think of the people who I know well enough to sort of answer that question for, I would certainly say yes.
Listening to Kevin speak about his own personal experience and his family really reminds me that when you know somebody, when it happens in your own family, somebody you really care about,
you just said it. Like it's so
right,
easy to
right.
say something that can be taken in a derogatory way.
But when you know somebody who is gay or trans or queer, things can really change for you.
And for a lot of folks who've never had to consider the life of a queer person and what that entails, and may have had negative attitudes toward queer people before, that's often the pathway that allows them to open up a new worldview, right? To let gay people into their lives. And I'm not saying that that's the way that it happened for Kevin, but that's the way he presented it to us in that audio that you just heard. And the net effect of that is that we now have somebody who is an ally. Kevin Anderson is an ally, helping us start and hopefully push the conversation forward. Now, something that Roger didn't answer, and I don't think Kevin answered it either, was the question of why we haven't had an openly gay ATP player before.
Right.
What are some of the reasons why you think that is the case?
I think, to be fair, they're not well positioned to answer that question.
Especially if you haven't really thought about it.
Absolutely, because it's tough even for us who have thought about it quite a bit. Nick McCarvel, you'll hear later in this episode, mentions tennis being an individual sport can possibly act as a barrier. In team sports, as we've seen, sometimes an out player can have the support of a community, of a team of people. In tennis, you're on your own, you have a small team. Players who aren't highly ranked may have a coach, and that's it. It can be a very lonely existence. And you just maybe don't know if you're going to be supported. If it's something that hasn't been talked about. If you are kind of the trailblazer, it takes a lot of courage. The other thing is that we have seen some instances of very high-profile homophobia in just the past few years. When Western society has become more open and accepting, a very few players have hit back, but loudly, right? And that's like Sergei Stakhovsky is kind of the number one example.
Somebody who has served on the ATP Council.
So you wonder if Stakhovsky is one of the only people speaking up in such an ugly way. Are there other people who believe it? Or if they don't believe it, they are not too perturbed by someone believing that. We also have, of course, Margaret Court. And she can be kind of the favorite punching bag for a lot of people in the tennis media sphere. But she has gone out of her way to denigrate Casey Delacroix's family.
Yeah.
As unholy or something not worthy.
We also know that when you are the first to do something, if somebody were to come out as being gay, on the ATP Tour tomorrow, say it's a top 100 player, it's something that you will be asked about and having to deal with outside of just focusing on your tennis for a very long time.
It will be your story.
It will. And there's a burden that comes with that. There are folks who cover the tennis beat on a week-to-week basis, and that story may be written for them this week. But then in the subsequent weeks, there's a whole set of different people coming in to cover the tennis. And that question will never go away. And if you think back to those of you who are queer and listening to the podcast and who have come out, even when you feel and you know that the world outside the closet is going to be very supportive, it's still a harrowing experience for even the most supportive of environments. And so there's a lot of unknown and a lot of fear that comes with that, let alone when you tie that to your professional livelihood, to a sport and a profession where one injury can change everything. And then what are you then reliant on? You are
Right.
just...
Are you just the gay tennis player?
Exactly. But what I want to talk about, though, is some of the structural barriers within the ATP itself. I mean, I just mentioned some personal barriers.
Right.
But what are the ATP Tour barriers that we perceive to be at play here as well?
We've talked about this before on the podcast. Is the ATP ready? Like, is it prepared if someone were to come out? Is there kind of a media plan in place? Because I'm sure they have contingency plans for all manner of things, crises, right?
Is there an organizational plan, a logistical plan, to then have support for a player if they were to go to Dubai as an openly gay player, or other countries where being out is not something that is dealt with favorably? Not just to say it's queer unfriendly, but dangerous even.
Yes.
For gay people.
Or unlawful.
Yes.
I think the ATP, like any international sports organization, has so much to think about. They have to think about the ways in which other cultures think about sexual orientation, because it could be quite different than the way we do in the West or the global North, so to speak. If we think of identity the same way, how do we understand and approach cultures who don't take an accepting view of LGBT people, or who don't believe that really exists, or that it's not an identity at all, that it's a behavior?
That it's not something that should be celebrated.
Right.
Or even deem it as something to celebrate in the first place. Like indifference could be
that
a
it's
barrier
not even
as
a
well.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's, I think, in sports in general, not to blame the ATP, there's just a lot of like, shut up and play. It's like, why, we've gotten a little of like, why are you even talking about this? Like, why would you even ask Roger Federer that question?
What is the impetus to even do this at this point? Everything is fine.
Right.
Like we don't have somebody trying to come out. But the idea here is to create that safe space for when somebody wants to and is ready to take on all that's going to come with it, because it's going to be a lot. And I don't doubt that there are well-meaning and good people who work within the ATP, who run the ATP, that there are ATP players who haven't spoken about this and don't want to speak about it, but in their private lives they're supportive as well. There are a lot of good people who allow something like this to fester and build over decades with good intentions but no action.
Right.
And so what I'm hoping for with this event being hosted by Nick McCarvel and sponsored by NCR, featuring Brian Vahaly, what I hope that's going to happen with Kevin now being an ally, what I hope for having Roger Federer's words on record, is that there's been a conversation started. And you'll hear Nick talk about that's one of the goals of this event, to get the conversation started. And eventually we'll be able to push through to the more micro details that will have to be dealt with eventually.
So I think that is a good place to bring in our discussion with Nick McCarvel, who you may know as an on-court announcer. He's written for USA Today. He covers figure skating as well.
He's covered sports for the Olympics, figure skating for the Olympics. He's everywhere. He does everything well. And he was a delight to talk to. And thank you, Nick, for putting this event together.
So we're here with Nick McCarvel, tennis writer, host, presenter, and the on-court announcer this year at Cincy Tennis. Congrats.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming on. We wanted to talk about this event you're going to be hosting in New York City at the Housing Works bookstore. Tell us a little about it and how it came about.
Yeah, so it's next Thursday, August 23rd, at Housing Works, as you mentioned, which is a great bookstore that's part of a AIDS nonprofit in New York City. I actually had my very first job in New York City at that bookstore. I was an assistant manager. So
cool.
it's full circle for me. And they do incredible events year-round. They have a monthly Moth podcast recording there, which is really cool. It sells out every month. And so I partner with them in May. And we started to kind of pull together this event, which I've been thinking about doing for a long time, which is basically just a public conversation about the queer community and the tennis community, because I'm queer and I'm also tennis in a way, because that's my job, it's my life.
We
and
three queers right now on the podcast.
We three queens. And there have been a lot of emails and conversations and back chatter about who could be a part of it, but Brian Vahaly, who is a former top 70 player, a great college player also at the University of Virginia, he came out last year on John Wertheim's podcast for Sports Illustrated, and he has been absolutely wonderful in accepting our invitation to be a part of the night. And we're really hoping to include some other out players as well. That's still TBA, so watch this space. But it's basically going to be a night of conversation about queer culture in tennis, about why Brian wasn't out when he was a player, about why he chose to come out last year, almost 10 years after retiring from pro tennis. And, a lot of the conversation when I'm in Hell's Kitchen or Fire Island or WeHo or wherever we gays tend to go when we're not on tour is, oh, you work in tennis, who's gay? And, the answer right now is that there's no out gay male players right now on the pro circuit. And there's a reason for that. I think there's a lot of fear, and I think that there's a lot of hesitation to be who you are and to be out loud about it. And I know that both of you spend some time on tour. I spend a lot of my time on tour. And the tennis community is incredible. It has obviously supported so many out lesbians who have been out during their pro career and after it. But this is a chance to move the conversation forward. And we've seen in the last 10 days, and you guys have been a part of that once the conversation has started publicly, it can only go forward. And so that's really the crux of this event, Brian getting to share his story, us moving the conversation forward. And honestly, it's not about outing or asking someone to come out. That's not the purpose of the night. The purpose of the night is that it's 2018 and let's talk about things, because we're in a culture where we continue to not want to talk about things, or we continue to be nervous to talk about things. So here's a chance to Brian's been gracious. We're also going to have tennis drag queens that I'm so excited to be a part of the night. A couple of friends, David Thorpe, who's the producer and star of Do I Sound Gay, the documentary.
Yes.
He will be there. And we have tennis trivia, we have giveaways. We also have a couple really special testimonials on video of people who can't be there, who want to lend their support. And I think that we're going to have a lot of great people. I've heard from the USTA, I've heard from the Intercollegiate Tennis Association, I've heard from Athlete Ally, I've heard from a lot of people who want to be a part of this night, and we are hoping that it's going to be fabulous.
Part of what got our involvement in this whole thing going was Kevin Anderson tweeting about the event and also having some great things to say about you and also gay people in his life, which was shocking for us and a lot of folks, because we absolutely do not see any ATP players speaking at all or even acknowledging that gay people exist.
Yeah, and here's the opportunity to forward this conversation, right? I was so humbled by what Kevin tweeted and shared about me, which was, I didn't mean to put the spotlight on me whatsoever, but here is a two-time major finalist, Wimbledon runner-up currently, a top 10 player in the world, speaking out about an issue that we have dear to our hearts and that he obviously has feelings about. And then he, as you guys followed up this week, asking him yourselves about it here in Cincinnati, he talked about his cousin who's out and gay and married his partner recently. And I think that there's probably more stories like that in pro tennis, but it just wasn't asked. Or it just wasn't, and I reached out to a few key people, including the team around Kevin Anderson, asking them, would you lend your support to this? And Kevin went above and beyond, and that tweet got over 1,000 likes. And I think that those are just the little things that this event has helped produce. And I hope over the next 10 days, as the event gets closer, and then thereafter, that's also why we're doing it on the eve of the 50th U.S. Open in the open era, is that we have the chance to say, okay, gosh, Billie Jean, Martina, Amelie, like they've done, and the list goes on, trust me. But they've done so much, and let's not fall asleep. Let's continue to move this conversation forward.
So tennis has such a great community of support among LGBTQ people. You see it at every tournament I'm sure you go to. What do you think are some of the barriers to getting people talking about gay men in tennis? And what are the barriers for coming out?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that it's worlds that coincide, right? They don't necessarily cross over that much. I mean, everywhere we go, whether it's Melbourne, Paris, Indian Wells, New York, London, Rome, I mean, there's gay fans of tennis everywhere. And
right.
I think a lot of young gay boys are attracted to women's tennis because it's appealing to us.
That's how we got
Yeah,
started.
yeah, same.
Right.
I mean, I literally used to print out every Monica Seles match report in the 90s. That's how I, sort of first got into the sport too. But it's a really good question, and I think that for the guys on tour, I can't really speak to that. I'm not a professional tennis player. I obviously work as a host and a presenter on tour, but I think in a lot of ways that tennis has a far way to go because of this is an individual sport, and you don't necessarily have the support of a team. And even when you guys asked Roger Federer about the issue, he didn't struggle in answering the question, but he struggled in finding the words because you can tell it's not a common conversation.
Yeah.
And is it a common conversation in any pro sport? Not necessarily, but we've seen barriers be broken by Robbie Rogers and by Michael Sam and by Jason Collins and so many out queer athletes who have, and now in the WNBA, it's not even, a lot of those women just get to live their lives. I think they're sort of the goal for a lot of us is to not have to think twice about it. But yeah, I think, for the queer community, because we love tennis so much, and then we also identify with these men who are playing pro tennis, it's two different conversations almost on the same track. But again, this is my hope that it just kind of helps continue and walk down that road. And who knows, there are gay tennis players, of course. There are gay men who play on the professional tennis tour. I'm not saying I know who any of them are, but would it be powerful to see a tweet from Kevin Anderson?
Yeah.
Would it be powerful to see the words of Roger Federer? I think so.
So, about this event, how can people get involved if they don't live in New York?
Yeah, so the event again is August 23rd, 7:30 p.m. We are going to be Facebook live streaming, all technological fingers crossed, on the No Challenges Remaining Facebook page. Ben and Courtney have been super supportive of the event. We're really excited that we've partnered with them. So it will be live on Facebook, hopefully with the Wi-Fi, depending. And then Ben and Courtney will do some sort of edited episode of the podcast thereafter in the few days after the podcast. Listen, if you want to donate to the cause, it's benefiting not only Housing Works, but the NYJTL, which was it was founded in part by Arthur Ashe, and they do so much great work with kids in the New York and New Jersey area who are underprivileged. A lot of them, I'm sure, are queer themselves and don't know it yet, but have a passion and a love for tennis like we do. So part of the proceeds will go to the NYJTL and Housing Works, and you can go to housingworks.org/events, and there is a donate button. So tickets are only $10. It's 2 for $15 before the night of. And I actually encourage people, if you do want to donate to the cause, and you can't come, don't buy tickets because that'll inflate our numbers. Just donate. Housing Works does incredible work trying to end the dual crises of AIDS and homelessness in New York and the area, and obviously the NYJTL. And then I just say, do what you guys did. I mean, you're here in Cincinnati. I wasn't in the press room when you asked Roger and Kevin about this issue. So kudos to you both. And I think, I'm a broken record, but the conversation continues. And, reaching out to a lot of former pro players, some current pro players, they're excited about this. And And that said, too, there's some hesitation.
Yeah.
And there's some people who have told me, you know what, Nick, thanks, but no thanks. And that's fine. Everyone has their own place and space. But here's a chance to take a moment and to have a conversation in the gayest city in the world, in New York City, in Soho, downtown, where so many big queer moments have happened. And we feel like this is a great chance to shine a spotlight on that. So again, tune in if you can. NCR Facebook page, 7:30 Eastern on the 23rd.
Nick, thank you
Yeah,
for
no
playing
worries.
your part in getting this
No
conversation
problem.
started as
Yeah.
well. We're happy to tangentially be a part of it. Like you said, it really is just about at this point getting the conversation started.
Yeah, and
There's a lot more to do once that conversation has been started. And I've seen a lot of folks say, well, even with respect to Roger's comments, you know, like, yeah, it's great, but, you know, that doesn't take into account for this or that or that or that. But at the base of it, it's about getting that conversation started.
I am curious, you guys tweeted that out and it got
Mm-hmm.
hundreds of interactions.
Yeah.
What was the general response from...
It was mostly very supportive. And of course, a lot of the issues that came up were like, well, he could have said this, he could have gone further in his support. And I think mostly he was a little surprised by the question.
Yeah.
And like many of us, struggle to find the right language. But I think, as you said, this conversation is about creating conditions for people to talk about it. And discourse is so powerful in making it safe and secure, or at least a little bit more, for people to be open.
Because some folks were saying he didn't use the word gay at all in his response. Some were saying, well, what about the fact that Sergei Stakhovsky has served on the ATP Tour Council for all this time? Like, it's all well and good to say that you personally support something, but what are the ways structurally that the ATP hasn't? You know, because something that I've always wondered is, say we have an openly gay tennis player, what happens when they have to travel the world to a country that is not only not gay friendly, but actually very dangerous for gay people to be out and loud about it if they so choose?
Yeah, and I would also say, you know, for me, I grew up in a Catholic family in Montana, and I dreamed of being a pro tennis player. I never even came close to being that. But I would say, you know, there are so many people that have faced atrocities around the world and have been persecuted for being out and gay and who they are. And I've hesitated at times to do this and to walk forward and say, okay, let's try and have this conversation. And it's been a good personal challenge. It's been a great professional challenge. And I really hope and think that we're going to have some good things come out of it. Already good things have come out of it. And we're also going to have a lot of fun on Thursday night, including some Martini Navratilova, one of our special drink, as well as the Jelly Bean King.
Oh my God.
These great details are just slipping out like one
There's
by one.
a lot of when we were planning it at Housing Works, the event coordinator was like, because there are a lot of moving pieces, including the drag queens did a Queens on the Street video that will debut at the night, asking people in New York City about their favorite tennis queens, and we hope to put all that online too.
You're saying you don't have a Ginny Bouchard?
I love that. Also, one of my friends said the Merez Mojito, which
yes.
I'm really sad. The drink menu's already been made up, but that means we have to do another iteration of the event down the road, at least even just for the drinks.
Nick, thank you so much for coming on the
no
show.
worries.
We
Thanks.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
All the best. Thank you for tuning into The Body Serve. We hope that this has been a good addendum to our Pride special. We hope that you're able to help push the conversation forward in whatever way that you can in your personal lives. We hope that if you're near New York City on August 23rd, that you go to this event, that you register. If you can't go, you donate, as Nick told you how you could in that past segment.
And in a broader sense, if you're somebody who feels that you've been excluded from sports media, if the people who ask the questions in this profession don't look like you and don't sound like you, we want to and we're trying to build a more inclusive tennis community, and I think this is a great step in that direction.
My name is Jonathan. You can find me on Twitter at tennis_John.
And I'm James. I'm at ElliotJMR.
2 L's, 2 T's.
Till next time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.